All right, happy Sunday night. My name is Wes. I'm the host of Conservatism on Tap, and always happy to be here. And today I have a special guest. This is really exciting. Typically, we have my brother John, who's on the show, my co host, but I'm giving him a week off. He's on vacation, so I am thrilled to be bringing on Josh Lewis, who is the host of the Saving Elephants podcast. Welcome, Josh. How you doing, buddy?
Wes, it's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for allowing a teetotaler to join Conservatism on Tap for the evening.
I appreciate it, man. So, as you know, I am not. I've got this barrel-aged, really tasty BART is what they call it, a blend of an imperial stout and berry wine ale that I've been saving up all week. So I'm going to be enjoying that. But you know what? You enjoy whatever you like. You got some water, some coffee. What do you got there, brother?
I've got a warm cup of, I don't know if you can see the appropriate Saving Elephants
I love it.
coffee
Yeah.
mug, but it's a warm cup of tea. It's Paris from Harney and Sons. I honestly don't know. I think it's their own special blend. It's a combination of caramel and vanilla and a few other special ingredients. It smells like perfume, but it doesn't taste anything like it.
That sounds fantastic, man. I could use some. We got some of the cold weather coming here. I know you live in Oklahoma. Is that right?
That is right.
Yeah, so in Florida, it's gone from smoldering, like scalding hot, to just, pretty hot, just like tolerable, right? Hot. So for us, that's fall, which is enough for me to get into to the heavy beers. What's it like up there in Oklahoma, man?
It's been unseasonably warm this time of year, to be honest. Around the end of October, anyways, is usually by the time we get hit Halloween, that's at least the first cold night, just about guaranteed. And every night after that gets kind of nippy. But I've been working from home exclusively since the pandemic. And I literally drag a table outside and work under the big open sky. It's one of the perks of working from home. I only had a bird poop on me once. That's the only hazard. But I know the weather here has been gorgeous.
Well, Josh, I'm so happy to have you on this show. And, it's more of a relaxed, kind of comfortable show. But I love getting live viewers. And it looks like we got 3 or 4 on there already. So if you guys are on the show, let us know where you're coming from. Josh is coming from Oklahoma. I'm coming from Florida. If you're coming from someplace else or one of those states, let us know where you're coming from tonight. But I can't wait to get into some of the content that you put out, man, because that really struck me going through your website. You've got, just like me, you're trying to further the conservative movement. You've had all these guests on your show. So we're going to get into that tonight. So I can't wait. But can you tell us a little bit about, the Saving Elephants podcast and what you're trying to accomplish with it specifically?
Yeah, Saving Elephants began in earnest shortly after the 2016 election. As the name implies, unless someone is thinking of saving actual elephants, it is an effort to resuscitate, revive, reform, call back to conservatism, the GOP. And that is in part, not exclusively because of, but initially anyways, my motivation was the election of Donald Trump. And what I love him or hate him, I think what all of us would probably rightly agree, a rather unusual election year. Full of lots of twists and turns nobody was truly expecting, and what appears to be the possibility that we're on the front end of a major realignment in the major parties.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do my tiny little bit to try to call back the Republican Party to a sense of traditional conservatism, not in any way that I felt that the GOP didn't need reform prior to Trump stepping on the scene. I don't mean that at all. In fact, I would even argue the advent of a candidacy like Donald Trump would indicate that there was a real need for a change of direction in some sort. And to me, that change of direction, much like what you guys are doing, classical conservatism, Burkean conservatism, and we can parse through what that means. Sure. There's a wide definition there, but I'm trying to call us back to a little bit more highbrow, a little bit more respectable intellectual tradition.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting, because we were just talking about the debates and stuff, and that's something that we've been talking about on this show, especially, and I think even within Trump supporters, there's a need for that. There was a respect for Pence in the recent vice presidential debate. How classy he was, how he held his ground without going low, without constantly interrupting Kamala Harris, things like that. So I think amongst many conservatives, they want to see that. There are times that Trump has acted presidential. We talked a few weeks on this show about how he handled Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, and when he was confronted with that, he had nothing but good things to say about her and her legacy, even though she was on the far left. So I could definitely see that both within and outside the Trump movement. But let's take a look. So I've got some images here that I captured when I was looking at your website. And you can see here it says that really the purpose is to gather millennials for the purpose of reigniting conservatism. And you say that conservatism is applying the wisdom of the past to the challenges of today. It is conserving the things that matter most or that most matter. And conservatism is an attitude of gratitude. So let's start with that, Josh. Can you explain that a little bit more? So you say it's an attitude of gratitude about what? Everything in the past, or are there specific things that we should, express gratitude for more than others? What do you think?
Certainly not everything.
Yeah.
I think the most succinct definition I have ever heard of conservatism was Sir Roger Scruton's idea that the conservative is a sentiment in which we recognize the things we love. And I'm not going to quote him directly, but I'll just try to get to the essence of it.
Yeah.
The things we love are breakable. They perish. They are maintained with effort. And that's a sentiment that, quite frankly, progressives, communists, just about anybody can hold.
Yeah.
But when you truly reflect on that, that is the heart, I think, of conservatism, which is rooted, if not gratitude, I would say actually rooted in love. We have to first develop what we are for. And conservatives, and unfortunately, there is a counterfeit conservatism, I would say, these days that begins first with, here is what I do not like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's totally fine and totally fair. There's an awful lot going on I do not like, and I don't think there's anything wrong with calling it out. But at some basic level, if you keep peeling back, you have to have something you're for before you can really proceed to, and here's what I don't like. You have to have something you can contrast it against. So I think that's where the gratitude comes in, is we have to first begin with what have we inherited. And I mentioned the past there, and maybe we're going on to this, but that is the general idea that conservatism is a group project among multiple generations within a culture ordinarily, or within a nation state.
Yeah.
And we recognize that we millennials don't have all the answers. The human race doesn't have all the answers, but we have a better shot at getting things right if we have the strength of mind to look to the past and try to glean from it what wisdom we can.
Oh, I love that, man. Just the humility, and what you're talking about, of recognizing that there are generations that went before us, and they weren't all stupid. Like, I think especially on the left, they tend to, focus on the negative. I've had liberals, on our channel before, and I was like, do you guys even love America? Because you spend so much time hating on it. Do you ever focus on any of the good things? And surprisingly, when they do, we can find many good people in the past and many good ideas that are worth preserving, and I think conservatives should be absolutely, like you're talking about, supporting that. I also think that civil discourse and debate is one of those things. We talk a lot about, John and I talk a lot about how the founding fathers were a mixed bag. I mean, you had people like, John Adams, you probably consider a conservative today, but then Thomas Jefferson, a moderate, maybe. I mean, he had some pretty leftist or progressive views at times. You look at someone like Tom Paine, and I think there's a lot of conservatives who want to pretend like he's a conservative, and he's just very much more of an Enlightenment, radical, anti-Christian, anti-religion in general. And yet he was right there, important to the founding. And then, of course, George Washington, who took his religion very seriously. And, see all these guys coming together to found the country, and it's been that way ever since. Are we going to sit here and say that no liberal has ever contributed anything of value to the country? It's just not true. Even if conservatives are the ones that we prefer and spend more time focusing on. And because of that mixed history in the country, because of that mixed bag of different philosophies, and the success that it's brought, to our country, I think we have to be in favor of that debate. So I love that you're doing that, man. That's great stuff. Great stuff. Let's take a look at more of the website here. So kind of get into the specifics of how you run it. So bringing up the main page, if you guys go to Saving Elephants, you'll see everything that he's got here. So you can see he's got a blog, he's got a podcast, all kinds of resources. So as we get into this, Josh, I kind of want to hear more of like your story, man. Like, so you mentioned that you're from Oklahoma. How did you get into doing all of this, and spending your time, building up this website and getting this following and getting all these great guests on your show? How did that come to fruition for you, buddy?
Well, I appreciate you saying I have great guests on the show. That chiefly comes through just blood, sweat, and tears. Nothing more than just trying to pay attention. Occasionally I can snag David French was my most recent guest. I feel like I definitely punched above my weight there, and I would like to think it's just some skill set on my part. It might have more to do with the fact he just wrote a book and we're in the middle of a once in a century pandemic, and he probably can't hawk it other than going on podcasts. So I just low hanging fruit for me.
No, I thought you did great. I listened to that one for sure and a couple others, and I thought you was fantastic, man. So,
Yeah, no, David was great.
yeah.
But in terms of me getting started, I mean, it was just a little at a time. It started off chiefly as a blog. I had never podcast before. I have always been fascinated with radio. It doesn't necessarily correlate or align to exactly where I am temperamentally, and in some cases even politically these days. But I really got my start in politics from listening to Untold Hours of Rush Limbaugh.
Really?
And
Yeah.
yes, and in fact, my entertainment growing up was listening to the radio. We didn't have a TV in our house. Our family was a member of an old-fashioned free holiness / Pentecostal church, and we just didn't have TV, so we listened to 1940s and 50s radio broadcasts for entertainment. And I just love listening to Rush Limbaugh.
Fascinating.
I didn't particularly know. I didn't necessarily have the ability to sort of discern for myself. I thought that I did, but I think I was simply regurgitating what I had heard. And I began to notice, and this somewhat falls in line with Saving Elephants, that there were those whose temperament were far more combative, say, to the left, and would treat those on the left as if they were the enemy to be destroyed and not necessarily fellow Americans to be reasoned with. I certainly disagree with the left, and I hope for their sake they would come to see my point of view, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they could school me about a thing or two. But I still feel like and look, let's be honest, there are some bad actors out there. This isn't indicative of everyone, but
Yeah.
I think there are some within the party that have the tendency to exemplify the bad actors as if they're indicative of the whole, and that therefore we can write off a third of the country as if they're just not worth spending any time a day. And so, this was an element I've noticed in the Republican Party forever, but it always seemed to be kind of that crazy uncle that you see once at Thanksgiving and just goes off about aliens or something.
Right.
And then it seems like over the last 4 years, this has become more pronounced and more prominent within the party. So this is part of the labor of love I've been in Saving Elephants, is trying to work against that temperament.
Well, yeah. So let's get into that. So just the notion of saving the party, saving the GOP, because someone could say, well, look, the GOP has the Senate, the GOP has the courts. Not only with Barrett, but even before. Let's say she does get. I mean, obviously nominated. Let's say she gets confirmed. There's a good chance that's going to happen. So you've got a conservative majority that's about to get stronger. They've got the presidency, and the election is pretty tight. So there's certainly a chance that Trump could pull it out. But he's obviously been successful these past 4 years in holding on to it, fighting off attempts from the left at impeachment, all these things. So a GOP that is in charge of the executive branch, the Senate, and the judicial system. Is that a GOP that needs saving? And if so, from what? Would be the question for you, Josh. I'm just curious.
And that's an excellent question. And it's one that I don't claim with totality I know the answer to. I will, well, first of all, let me try to parse through. Saving the GOP kind of has two different fronts to it.
Yeah.
One is, sure, the GOP could win office, but to what effect if they have actually abandoned the very principles that I, as a Burkean conservative, say would stand for. Conversely, I do think that the GOP is in long-term trouble. And I think this for demographic reasons that the GOP has known about, that it's been known about for many years during Barack Obama's presidency on up to the 2016 elections. I don't want to say that Donald Trump's ability to win the White House was such a fluke that it was just some black swan event that could never be replicated in history. It is a possibility, certainly. But if you roll the dice, the GOP is mostly reliant on an ever-shrinking force. And I think you've mentioned this already, but Saving Elephants is specifically targeted to us, to millennials, because I am most concerned about millennials. If you look, there are plenty of millennials that are diehard Trump fans.
Yeah.
More power to them. That's fine. But the fact remains that is not the majority of us. I mean, it just isn't. And the GOP is going to be in real trouble if it can't find a way to have a broader appeal, by which I don't necessarily mean watering down the message, but rather focusing the message on all Americans, say, rather than those that happen to buy into the most stringent version of whatever the party happens to be selling at the moment.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but Kim Klasik is running for Congress out of Maryland, the whole district around Baltimore, and she's got a message that is just so powerful. So African American, young girl who's out there running against, the establishment, deep seated Democratic area, and she's got a message that's very like focused on poverty, focused on minorities, focused on the people, and she interviews people in some of her ads. She is walking through the streets of Baltimore saying, if the left and its policies work, then why is Baltimore still in such abject poverty? Where are the Democratic politicians who claim to love this area so much, and why are they letting it fail? And to me, that resonates with me too. Josh, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and I always struggled in Memphis because I saw kind of the outcome of leftist policies there, a lack of investment in education, a lack of investment in law enforcement, all this
Mhm.
corruption within the city. And I'm like, are these the people that really care? Or can we get someone in here who actually invest in the right things with, smart, prudent government that's focused on these things as opposed to, multiple NBA stadiums and like essentially get rich quick schemes that really didn't pan out. And I wonder if a message that's focused more on that would be successful, because I see like glimmers of it in Klasik. Doing very well in her election, a chance that she could win in this area. She's very much a Trump supporter. Very big on supporting the president, and yet she has this message that is really focused on areas that I think that the entire movement can benefit from. So, just curious if you have any thoughts on that, or what you think a elephant saving message would look like.
Klasik in particular, to be honest with you, the only thing I know about her is what you've told me about when we spoke prior. And I think
Yeah.
my comment there, which holds true today, is gosh, if a Trump supporting Republican from Baltimore can win election, my hat off to them.
Right.
More power to them. That would be incredible. Look, I do not claim any special insight as to exactly what a winning message is. Say, I think there is a way in which Ronald Reagan, for instance, I think, while he wasn't perfect, crafted probably the closest to what we might call a traditional conservative approach via policy.
Yeah.
But there were others, Barry Goldwater, for instance, that tried to do the same and failed.
Yeah.
Now, Goldwater had his supporters, but his particular demeanor, his particular way of saying things just didn't work. There are two kind of buckets we're working with here. One is how do you win election? The other being how do you actually advance the principles that we want to see advanced?
Yeah.
And those things, you have to keep both of those in view at the same time. I will say this again, going back to the millennial idea, is millennials are really unique. I think we're fairly contrarian when it comes to politics. I mean, if you think about the candidates that have just lit millennials on fire, Barack Obama is probably about the closest you can come to like an establishment type candidate. But even then, he was bucking the Clinton machine. He was somewhat anti-establishment. But even more so, Bernie Sanders, Ron Paul, left or right. And I'm not saying these are necessarily the individuals I support, but I think there is a real appetite among younger Americans to elect a president that, I mean, good grief, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, I think, are all within 2 or 3 years of each other in age.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what you're
and
going.
and that is indicative of something larger going on there. And as much as there are these bruising back and forth fights, quite frankly, it's not that different in a certain vein.
Yeah.
It's still the same sort of structure of government, and we're mostly largely having meaningless fights that are more sort of virtue signaling to each other. And I think there's a real appetite among millennials. I don't have the winning message for how exactly this gets through, and I hope it's a conservative that finds a way to do it, that can find a way to chart and say, no, I'm actually different. I am attempting to break outside of the mainstream, the way things have always been done. I think Trump obviously is an example of that, but he's not one that appeals to millennials, and in my personal view, is not one that necessarily carries a clear conservative message also.
Yeah.
But he is an example of someone who has found a way to break outside of the mainstream, and he's done well with that.
Huh. That's interesting, because one of the big appeals for Trump for a lot of people is that he was willing to fight political correctness, right? Like that was the start of it. I always go back to that confrontation he had with Megyn Kelly, when She had the
Yeah.
politically correct question, and he refused to like go in line, and everybody else on that stage would have done that. And so that was kind of his biggest contribution early on to, you know, the system and the game, is that I'm not going to play that game the way other people have done it. And I think people love that. But which you're talking about, I think, is fundamentally bigger. Is someone who, you know, goes against the larger system, because there's many things that Trump hasn't been able to accomplish. Getting back to kind of like the principles that you've talked about, and I mean entitlement spending, and how much the government has grown, how much the government has spent. I mean, these are huge issues that, you know, Trump has pulled back some of the taxes, but the spending, even before COVID, was just through the roof, you know, above
Hmm.
Obama levels. And we just kind of let that go. There's so many issues where, you know, we've kind of let go of the fiscal responsibility, especially in the spending side. And Trump admitted that, you know, he was like, listen, I'm not going to touch that Medicare, Medicaid, all those programs. And I think that at some point there's a potential for someone to jump in and say, much like Klasik, like, hey, there are other ways to do this that can help people that are struggling more in these huge government programs, and this is how. But you're right, it's going to take an enormous amount of work. I mean, you know, building up your podcast and all that stuff, like how much it takes to get a following, and especially with, you know, the way the structure is now with these big news organizations and Fox and CNN and all that stuff, or the amount of money that goes into, you know, all the social media outlets already. It's so corporatized, it's so big business. You know, it's something we've talked about, I think, a few times, is how people get in these echo chambers. You know, they get into
Hmm.
areas where everything on their phone, you know, just kind of like confirms wherever they're at. And this is so dangerous, especially for the extremes, is you get someone who's on the left and they never encounter a conservative. You get someone who's a moderate. They never encounter someone who believes different, you know? And, you know, that's why I support so much of what you're doing, man, is like, you know, creating this podcast and reaching out to all these different people and trying to start this conversation. It's the same thing that we're doing here, is trying to facilitate conversations between others, because who knows, you know, maybe there's are some assumptions, some stereotypes, some misapprehensions that we have about other people that we can start to work on, and maybe find some type of solutions that draw from the best of both. That's the hope. And again, going back to the founders, I feel like they had that. I feel like, you know, I mean, you have Jefferson, you have Benjamin Franklin, who I really wouldn't consider to be conservatives in really any sense, who are writing, you know, the Declaration of Independence with John Adams, and something that we all love. Every American loves, especially conservatives, and yet it came from people who, in many ways, believe different things. So, yeah, I find that fascinating. Let's take a look, though, at going back to the website. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've got? So, you got the podcast, the resources. Can you break this down for us, and kind of explain more about what we can access from your site?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I presume the buttons are probably relatively self-explanatory, but the read the blog there is, of course, I attempt a weekly blog at least. I've been taking a break in the month of October, but a weekly blog that, while it can cover many topics, loosely speaking, generally falls into two large buckets. And really, it all centers around a simple question: what is conservatism? The question's simple, the answer is not. And I actually would challenge anybody who thinks it is, seriously, do some reading and studying yourself and see if you can untangle it. I've been at this for years, and it's difficult. But the two buckets within that broader question are, first of all, I pick a conservative principle: prudence, the idea of limited government, the idea of the celebration of variety. And I try to parse through what exactly does that mean and how might it be applied. The other is, I think sometimes it's easy to understand what something is by comparing against something that's not. And so I try to compare and contrast conservatism to classical liberalism or libertarianism or even authoritarianism or socialism.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other buttons there, the podcast is probably self-explanatory. Twice a month, I drop a podcast, either myself speaking, sometimes from some things I've written, or I try to get some guests because I'm sure the audience doesn't want to just hear from me all the time. And then that last button, resources, is when I try to come across websites such as yourself that are not only quality, but also in the vein of trying to flesh out some sort of intellectual conservatism.
Yeah.
I want to promote that. And I want others to be able to find the resources themselves so that they're not just relying on me to try to answer these questions, because in my view, conservatism really is a group project. It's a generational conversation we just pass down from one era to the next.
Oh, that's great. I love that, man. Because you talked about Rush Limbaugh at the beginning, and I think he's done an enormous amount of work to bring some sense of conservatism to, like you said, the radio airwaves and to the broader masses. That's a great starting point. That's someone to check in, but it's not the only voice. And he didn't invent conservatism, nor its theory, nor can explain all of its beliefs because he's just one guy, right? And so expanding kind of your understanding of it, and like you said, these long conversations that have been happening for decades and decades. I mean, that's why we dedicate our channel to Burke, is because, I mean, he's not even an American. He's an Irish guy,
Yeah.
from the 18th century, but he was huge in the early modern times of bringing conservative ideas to light, including many of the ideas that the founders read and brought over. And that's why I love him. He was a huge supporter of America and had so many good things to say about why we should conserve aspects of the past and how we do that. What principles do we use to discern which things we should preserve and which ones that we should discard. So same type of conversation, man. I love it. So let's know. So what's the website again, just so everybody knows?
SavingElephantsblog.com. Saving elephants is taken by people trying to save elephants. More power to them. But SavingElephantsblog.com.
Awesome. And then I think you're on Spotify, right? Apple, a couple other places like that as well.
Yes.
Good deal, man.
Exactly.
Well, thanks so much. Looks like we got a comment here. I want to drag that in and we'll take a look at it here. So this is Kenneth Williamson. Let me go ahead and drag this comment here so we can take a look. And so you can tell me what you think. This is my favorite part of the show, is when we get comments from our interviews, we get to answer them live. So Kenneth says, we need to help folks recognize the value of conservatism. It's not necessarily the do's and don'ts, but a path to growth as an individual and a society. Man, I love that. Demonstrate why conservatism will benefit millennials in the future. I think conservatism has been demonized by a well-orchestrated educational system, among others. The left recognized a lack of well-rounded cultural knowledge and history in the minds of the young and executed their plan. Josh, I like the prudence description. So leave that comment up here because that's a lot of meat there. I love it when we get comments like this. So what are your thoughts for Kenneth?
No, definitely. And this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. I think if you genuinely believe conservatism is something of value and worth sharing, it's going to be really challenging to truly think of a third of Americans as your enemy you're just trying to destroy. I don't. I think that, again, there are bad actors or some people that I just choose not to debate for obvious reasons. I don't think they genuinely want to debate in a civil manner. But I want to engage with people because I think that conservatism is right, not necessarily, as Kenneth is saying here, not just on an individual basis. I think, as the website Saving Elephants says, it holds, in my view, a lot of the answers that millennials are struggling with.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of this? What direction are we trying to push society? How do we seek diversity and equate that and equality and liberty, and how do those things balance, and what do we do when there are inherent conflicts? Well, these turns out are questions that our ancestors have been wrestling with for millennia, and why not dig into that and try to, maybe they've got some ideas that we would benefit from.
That's a great answer, man. I love the part two when Kenneth says to demonstrate why conservatism will benefit millennials in the future. And like I can tell you, as a millennial myself, it certainly benefited me because it gave me a way to navigate through intellectual waters, including I went to the University of Virginia, so very liberal college, Thomas Jefferson, right? Like all of that. And I was able to navigate through it because I had Burke. I had all these great authors, Tocqueville and all these other great authors from the past who, gave me principles that helped me stay grounded. They helped me apply things like my faith, Burke being a Christian himself, to the political and intellectual sphere in ways that were sophisticated and defensible, and so I could, hang with pretty much any professor that, came up against me in school and have very solid arguments that many of them respected. So, I mean, that's a benefit right there. But then even more in life, Josh, is like, as I approach things, I know now to be prudent, as you said, we both talked about that. Is whenever I encountered a new situation, my first instinct is to say, who's encountered this before? So hey, we're having kids, right? Like my wife and I, and now my first instinct is to go read some books and learn from some previous dads. Like, what are the smart ways to do is to absorb information into it, so that when I encounter this situation, I'm not starting purely on my own effort. That's that humility that you were talking about before. Is
Yeah.
I have a system for that. If I'm given a new job at work, my first instinct as a conservative is to say, who's done this before and what can I learn, from them on it. Maybe I don't repeat everything that they've done. Maybe I want to change things, but I can learn just as much from people's mistakes as I can, from their successes. And I want to pass that on to the next generation. So there's the benefit right there, is you imagine having a worldview that helps you navigate through life to apply these principles to the smallest of situations all the way up to government and all the big things we're talking about. To me, that's the benefit of conservatism, to us. And then secondly, to your point of interacting with other people, is conservatism. You can see through history how people have worked together. And I think a lot of times that is on the basis of understanding where the other person is coming from, right? Like, so I encounter people all the time who are liberal, who are moderate, but they're not the first ones that I've encountered. When I have a conversation with a socialist, yeah, like I've talked to a lot of socialists, and you start to pick up on things, that matter to them. But like, let me get, you really care about people that are in poor situations, don't you? And they're like, yes, they do. Well, I do too, as a conservative. That may shock you, to Kenneth's points about how
Hmm.
conservatism has been demonized. They're like, wait, you care about poor people too? Yes, like I've been to Africa multiple times. I've volunteered with my church. We've given, all this money away. We care about poor people too. We're not this evil, racist, selfish movement that you think we are. And they're like, man, I didn't know that. Maybe we have something in common. Yeah. Now let me tell you why conservatism is the answer and socialism is stupid. But like, at least we have a common ground, right? Like, is you can find that. I've done that with Muslims. I've done that with atheists. I've done that with other conservatives. Is you find differences, but you also find agreement. And the reason I know to do that is because I've seen what worked, and what didn't, and you can see that in the past. So I love that, man. I think we agree on a lot. Really appreciate you being on the show. I think this is just the first, hopefully, of many conversations to come. But best of luck with the podcast and everything that you're doing. Let us know how we can help. That's, again, Saving Elephants Podcast. You can look at that online. Again, Spotify, all the major podcast sources. Take a look at what Josh is doing. Look at some of the resources that we've described today. Any last words, Josh, before we go out for the rest of the night?
I don't know that I can improve upon what you've just said, so I'll just leave it at that.
Appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for the comments there, Kenneth, and we'll see you guys next Sunday.